Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm doing weeks 18, 19, and 20 of my 2022 reads. I took May off from filming as a bit of a vacation to myself, and now I'm coming back and trying to wrap up all of the books that I've read. So this week there will be this wrap up, and then later on this week there will be a wrap up of week 21. I kind of split them up this way because I finished a bunch of things at the end of May, and so that makes week 21 a little bit heavier in terms of number of books. So this way it's a little bit more equally distributed. Oh, and also I'm going to wrap up my DNFs in the week 21 wrap up. So today I've got about 10 books to talk about, and I'm excited to share what I've been reading with you. Timestamps and content warnings are in the description box below. So first, I finished the graphic novel adaptation of A Wrinkle in Time, translated into Spanish, Una arruga en el tiempo, by Madeleine L'Engle, illustrated and adapted by Hope Larson, translated into Spanish by Aina Baraldes. So this is a book that my cousin had gotten for me a couple of years ago because I'd wanted to practice Spanish, and it was a great gift, and yet I dragged my heels because it's hard to read in Spanish. I don't have very good Spanish. And finally, I was prompted to buddy read this because Rachel at Kalanadi also got a copy of this because we talked about wanting to read more in Spanish, and we buddy read this, and that was such a great motivation. I have read A Wrinkle in Time before, and so I kind of knew this storyline. It's not my favorite book, but it was interesting to get the chance to reread it, especially because this was a graphic novel adaptation, and so you kind of see like the way that Hope Larson imagines these characters and their emotions, and just trying to struggle through the Spanish, but having the pictures there was actually really nice. I think that the story still isn't my favorite, but I enjoyed the process of reading it, and I really enjoyed getting to buddy read this with Rachel. I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read a few of the novels that are shortlisted for the Hugo Awards this year that I had been meaning to get to. The first was A Desolation Called Peace by Arkady Martine. This is the sequel to A Memory Called Empire, and I had been really looking forward to this. I'd even pre-ordered the ebook kind of long time ago, but it had sat on my e-reader for quite a while. And then I actually had picked it up in January, but I just was not getting along with it, and so I'd put it down for a few months. But when I saw that it was a finalist for the Hugos, I thought, okay, let me go ahead and finish reading this. So I did finish reading it, but it was real touch and go for me. Even though I had really enjoyed the first book in this series, this second book just was a struggle. I think that the storyline I actually was fine with, but I had such an issue with the writing style, and I have no memory at this point of whether or not this was the case in the first book, but in the second book I noticed, and I'll put up an image here, that every page was filled with so many italicizations and em dashes as a form of emphasis, and it really intruded on my reading experience because it felt like somebody just tapping me on the shoulder as I was reading and be like, hey, did you notice this word? Pay attention to this word. And it was every page. It was unbelievable. I could not get over it. So I think maybe, if you listen to the audiobook, obviously that's not going to be an issue for you, but I could not get into the book because this drew me out of the story every page. It was such a struggle to get through, but I did think that the story itself was pretty interesting, and the sci-fi elements, it's a first contact story. I have seen other first contact stories that have very similar ideas in them though, so that wasn't entirely new for me. There was also a little bit of relationship drama, which isn't like hugely my style. So whereas the first book had a lot of themes and a lot of aspects that really drew me in, this one just didn't quite work for me as well, and that issue with the writing style meant that I actually didn't enjoy it that much. So I gave this 3 out of 5 stars, but it really was not the book for me. Next, I finished The Galaxy and the Ground Within by Becky Chambers. This is the 4th book in the Wayfarers series, which is a very hopeful type of space opera. This story takes place on sort of a way station, sort of a hotel for people to come to as they are traveling through space. And some people who are traveling there get stuck because there's sort of a power outage that means nobody can leave for an unknown period of time. And this is all about these characters who are very different from each other, kind of learning about each other and learning to understand one another, while also dealing with quite quite a bit of internal turmoil because they have places they need to go and things they need to do. And so it's a very character-focused book with kind of a slice of life type of style. It is very gentle. It has a lot of really beautiful political themes just about accommodations and understanding. At times it did run a little bit saccharine for me, and there wasn't necessarily as much of a plot throughout as I could have wanted, but it was still such a gentle story, and I really liked the political messaging and the world building in terms of imagining these incredibly different cultures and the way that everybody would interact. So I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And then the last Hugo nominated novel that I read was She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. So this is a historical fantasy set during the Yuan dynasty in China, so around the 1300s, I believe. And this is intense in terms of the historical richness of it. I absolutely love historical fiction and historical fantasy so much. And this is basically a gender-queered version of the story of the founding of the Ming Dynasty, which is sort of when the native Chinese people took over China from the Mongol invaders. And so it is really fascinating in terms of politics. This is very much a military fantasy as well. There is so much about the armies and the tactics and the politics that goes behind all of that. I actually really enjoyed all of that. It is a little bit grim at times. I wouldn't call this quite grim dark, but it is definitely grim. The characters are, you could say, morally gray, but a lot of them are just bad people. And I think that in a sense that is also one of the themes of this story, because it's talking so much about power and the quest for power, and how just inherently cruel a lot of that is. And so there's a lot of commentary in this and a lot of themes that I liked, and just all of the conversations about gender queerness. It's just really interesting, and I thought it was incredibly well written, but just a little bit dark at times for me and a little bit violent. But still, I was so engaged with this. I really couldn't put it down, and I'm very excited because I think this is going to be a duology. So the next book is going to be the conclusion of the series, so I'm very excited to continue with that as well. And I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. And then, coincidentally, I read another historical fantasy featuring Mongols, although this time in the 9th century, which was All the Horses of Iceland by Sarah Tolmie. So this is a historical fantasy about an Icelander who goes along the Silk Road and ends up in a Mongol camp where he ends up, acquiring a lot of different horses to bring back to Iceland. So it's the story of how these horses get back. And this is just, again, really immersive in the history. I loved also that there was so much stuff about Mongolian culture that was found both in She Who Became the Sun as well as All the Horses of Iceland. So that was really neat to kind of read those so close to each other and see that, even though there's hundreds of years separating the two. And I just, the story style itself is very much that old myth, old folklore type of retelling feeling, even though it's a modern story. So I really liked the atmosphere and everything like that. I don't know that this book necessarily did so much in terms of themes for me or characters, but the atmosphere and the history were really interesting, as well as the mythology, the kind of mysticism and beliefs and magic that are just part of the world at that time. And so I really enjoyed this, actually. Even if it didn't necessarily hit some deeper themes for me, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I picked up a real treat for myself, which was Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. So this is a book that I'd heard about from Becca at ReadBecca. I'll link her channel as well as her review of this book below because I loved this. I loved this. If you are somebody who likes fantasy settings, but also kind of likes foodie stories and romance and just gentle, very slice of life, low stakes, cozy stories, you're gonna love this. It is amazing. So this is basically about an orc warrior who decides that she's gonna retire and create a coffee shop. And coffee is a thing that isn't really popular in this part of the world, but in her travels, she's come across it in other places and she just loves it so much. And so she goes ahead and sets up a coffee shop and ends up, kind of having a found family of people around her to help her build up this shop. And it is just so sweet. And it's great because you have all of these things about, like, you know, coming up with the idea for iced coffee and everything. It's so wonderful because it's kind of very much modern coffee shop culture, but put into this fantasy setting. And it's all about somebody following their dreams and trying to figure out who they are and not be defined by how other people see them or what their past is. Really adorable, so gentle and cozy. Definitely check out Becca's review. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars, and I might even need to buy myself a physical copy because I loved this. Next, I read Unladylike by Kristen Conger and Caroline Irvin, illustrated by Tyler Fetter. This is a nonfiction handbook, basically, for intersectional feminism. It is not a graphic novel or anything like that, but rather it is nonfiction that has a bunch of really fantastic illustrations and visualizations and diagrams and things like that that are illustrated throughout, and it's really, really effective. And I think that this is an excellent handbook. So it really talks about so many different aspects of intersectional feminism, as well as just like how to be an adult. There's so much in this about issues of economic inequality and issues of consent and sexuality and issues of societal expectations for women. There's issues of queerness, there's issues of also just sort of relationships and like how to have adult friendships, how to have relationships that are romantic, how to do all sorts of things. Also just how to really be part of coalitions and rebel against the patriarchy. So I think that this book is just such a great introduction for anybody who's looking to be more feminist or more activist, but also I kind of just feel like this is a great handbook for anybody who is kind of becoming an adult and wants a little bit of really helpful advice for how to be a good adult in this world. I think that the author's writing style was funny, but I'm very picky about my humor, and this was just a little bit on the snarky side for me. So that wasn't totally my style, but I'm sure that for a lot of people that would just make it so much more readable and really enjoyable. So I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I would just really recommend it. Then I listened to a couple of memoirs on audiobook, starting with How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones. So this is Jones's memoir of growing up as a gay black man in Texas and sort of what that meant, his sexual awakening, sort of understanding what it meant to be gay, a lot of his experiences there, but also so much of this is about his family, about his very religious grandmother and about his mother, who he was incredibly close to, but also really struggled to communicate with at times. They just didn't openly talk about things, especially about him being gay, but they were also incredibly closely connected despite that lack of communication. And his mom was dealing with also some very serious health issues. And so just so much of this story is about that relationship. And I loved every part of this that talked about him and his mother. That was just so heart-wrenching and so beautiful and so wonderful to see their relationship and that closeness. I think that a lot of the parts that we're talking about, especially his sexual experiences when in college, were a little bit much for me, especially because many of them were kind of dangerous and maybe not so healthy. So that was a lot to read about, but also just kind of a very important part of his experiences. So maybe not everything in this was so much for me, but I still think it was a really good memoir, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The other memoir that I listened to was Sitting Pretty by Rebecca Tossig. This is a book that I'd heard about from Jen at Jen Campbell, who I'll link below, and I'm so glad that I picked this up. One, I just love Tossig's writing in this. She's got such a conversational style that has humor, but also so much heart and really vulnerability as well as she shares her story. I really, really enjoyed listening to this especially, but I also just loved everything that Tossig had to say. I kind of want to get this book as a physical copy so that I can go through and make notes, because there were a lot of really insightful pieces that she had in here where it combined her own experiences, her own memoir, but also with these sort of essay forms, kind of arguing for the way that we should think about disability and be activists for disability rights. And I thought it was wonderful. She talks about everything in here, from the way that, kind of society views dating and romance and childbearing and all of these sorts of things for disabled bodies, as well as stuff like her struggles to find accommodations in terms of housing or go on the bus, or, just all sorts of things about the interactions between society and her disabled body. And it's so well done. It's really funny, and it has such great insight, especially if you haven't read much about kind of disability activism and issues of ableism and things like that. I think that this would be an excellent intro. But even if you have, like, I've read a number of things, but I still found so much in here to take out from it. And it was just such an enjoyable read. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars, and I would highly, highly recommend it. And then lastly, I read a manga in Japanese that I'd heard about from Kazen at Always Doing, so I'll link her below, called わたしを支えるもの, すーちゃんの人生, which is part of the Soo-chan series by Masuda Miri. And the title roughly translates to, and I was asking Kazen about this, something like Things That Sustain Me. And it's basically about this character Soo-chan as well as her other friend. They're both women in their 40s, and they're kind of just thinking about life. So this is very, very much slice of life, very much these women going about their lives and thinking about some of the stuff that's affecting them. So thinking about aging, thinking about also parents aging, parents getting sick, what that means for them, the way that they interact with people who are elderly, what they find fulfillment in life. It's just a lot of sort of contemplation of life and contemplation of aging. And there were definitely things in here that I really related to so much. Just stuff like, feeling like you're a real adult when you've gone to your HOA meeting, that kind of thing. So yeah, I found this incredibly relatable. It was a very calm and contemplative book. The only thing that was a little bit rough for me was that this is a manga designed for adults to read, which means that it doesn't have furigana, which is sort of the way to pronounce difficult kanji characters that manga meant for teenagers and kids has. And my literacy is limited in Japanese. And so without the furigana, I definitely struggled a bit. So I would say I probably understood about 60% of this. I did use a little bit of a dictionary app to look up some characters when I really felt like I needed that in order to understand what was going on. But I don't like to use dictionaries very often when I'm reading in other languages. I just kind of muddle through. So yeah, I didn't understand everything, but everything that I understood, I loved. I really, really liked this. It just was the sort of manga that I want to read at this point in my life. And luckily my library has a few others by Masuda Miri, and so I'm going to go ahead and check those out at some point in the future and give them a shot as well. She also has some essay collections that I kind of want to read, but there's no way. I just know that my Japanese is not up to that. Without the pictures, it's going to be like totally contextless for me. In any case, I loved this. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I don't believe that these books are translated into English, which is such a shame, but if you have any sort of literacy in Japanese, or if the series happens to be translated into your language, I really, really recommend it. I absolutely loved it. Okay, so that is everything that I have read for weeks 18, 19, and 20. If you guys have read any of these, definitely let me know your thoughts down below, or if you're interested in them, or if you have any thoughts at all, or let me know what you guys have been reading while I've been away. I would love to catch up with you. Just leave me a comment down below.